Two women lived in different places and at different times. One lived in Germany in the early 19th century, and the other lived in northern England several decades later. They had no connection to each other, but when you follow their lives over time, a similar pattern begins to appear. In both cases, people around them became ill in ways that did not seem unusual at first, because illness was common and many families experienced repeated losses without clear explanations. The symptoms often followed a familiar course, beginning with weakness, then moving into stomach pain, and gradually leading to a decline that could still be understood as natural for that period. During these periods, both women were present in the same role, staying close to the sick and taking care of them in a way that appeared responsible and expected. Without further ado, let us get into the story. Mary Ann Robson was born on October 31, 1832, in Low Morsley, a mining area in County Durham. Her father, Michael Robson, worked as a colliery sinker, and her mother was Margaret, whose maiden name was Lonsdale. She was baptized shortly after her birth, on the 11th of November, at St. Mary's Church in West Rainton. The family included 3 children. Mary Ann had a younger sister, Margaret, who was born in 1834 but died within a few months, and a brother, Robert, who was born in 1835. When Mary Ann was 8 years old, the family moved to the nearby village of Merton, another community shaped by coal mining. At that time, her life appeared stable, and later descriptions from people who knew her as a child reflect that impression. Her Sunday school superintendent described her as a regular and exemplary attendee, with an innocent disposition, average intelligence, and a particularly clean and tidy appearance. That stability did not last. In February 1842, her father died in a mining accident after falling approximately 150 feet down a shaft at Merton Colliery. His body was returned to the family in a sack marked as property of the South Hetton Coal Company, a detail that reflects how closely workers' lives were tied to the industrial system they depended on. His death created immediate economic pressure. The family's housing was linked to his employment, which meant that his widow and children faced the risk of eviction. Within a year, in 1843, her mother remarried. Her new husband, George Stott, was also a miner, which suggests that the family remained within the same economic and social structure. At the age of 16, Mary Ann left home to begin working. She took a position as a nurse in the nearby village of South Hetton, in the household of Edward Potter, who was a manager at Merton Colliery. This role placed her in a domestic environment connected to the same industry that had shaped her childhood. After several years, when the children in that household had been sent away to boarding school in Darlington, she returned to her stepfather's home. At that point, she trained as a dressmaker, moving into a different form of work that still remained within the boundaries of domestic labor. In 1852, at the age of 20, Mary Ann Robson married William Mowbray, a colliery laborer, at the Newcastle upon Tyne Register Office. Shortly after their marriage, the couple moved away from County Durham to the southwest of England, where they began their life together. During this period, several of their children are reported to have died at a young age. Accounts from the time of her later trial suggest that 4 or 5 children died while they were living there, although none of these deaths were officially recorded. Birth and death registration was legally required, but the system was not strictly enforced until 1874, which means that gaps in documentation were not unusual. The only recorded birth from this time is that of their daughter, Margaret Jane, who was born in 1856 in St. Germans. After some years, William and Mary Ann returned to the northeast of England. William's work shifted within the same industrial environment, first as a fireman on a steam vessel sailing out of Sunderland, and later as a colliery foreman. During this period, more children were born. A daughter, Isabella, was born in 1858. Margaret Jane, their first recorded daughter, died in 1860. Another daughter was born in 1861 and given the same name, Margaret Jane, which was a common practice at the time when a child had died. In 1863, a son named John Robert William was born, but he died the following year from gastric fever. In January 1865, William himself died from what was described as an intestinal disorder. His death marked a turning point in the household, not only because of the loss itself, but also because of the financial structure connected to it. Both William and the children had been insured through the British and Prudential Insurance Office. After his death, Mary Ann received a payment of £35, which would have been roughly equivalent to half a year's wages for a manual laborer at the time. She also received a smaller payment of £2.05 for the death of her son, John Robert William. At this point, the pattern of the household can be seen more clearly. Multiple children had died over a relatively short period of time. Most of those deaths were not formally recorded, and each loss existed alongside a system that placed a measurable financial value on death. Soon after the death of her first husband, William Mowbray, Mary Ann moved to Seaham Harbor in County Durham, where she began a relationship with Joseph Nattrass. During this period, another loss occurred within her family. Her daughter, the second Margaret Jane, who was about 3.5 years old, died of typhus fever. By that point, out of the many children she had borne, estimated to be up to 9, only one remained alive. Her surviving daughter, Isabella, became her only child. Mary Ann then returned to Sunderland and took up work at the Sunderland Infirmary, an institution that included facilities for the treatment of contagious diseases. Her role placed her in an environment where serious illness, particularly fever-related conditions, was a regular part of daily life. At the same time, she made a decision regarding her remaining child. Isabella was sent to live with Mary Ann's mother, separating the child from the immediate household. While working at the infirmary, Mary Ann met George Ward, an engineer who was one of her patients. The relationship developed quickly, and the two were married on August 28, 1865, at St. Peter's Church in Monkwearmouth. Ward's health, however, remained poor. He suffered from a prolonged illness that involved paralysis and ongoing intestinal problems. Despite the length and severity of his condition, his death on October 20, 1866, was described by the attending doctor as unexpectedly sudden. The official cause of death was recorded as English cholera and typhoid, diagnoses that were commonly used at the time to describe severe gastrointestinal illness. Following his death, Mary Ann once again received an insurance payout. At this stage, the sequence of events begins to take on a more defined structure. A relationship forms, illness develops, death follows, and a financial payment is made, while the number of surviving family members continues to decrease over time. In November 1866, Mary Ann entered a new household. She was hired as a housekeeper by James Robinson, a shipwright living in Pallion, Sunderland, whose wife Hannah had recently died. Within a month, another death occurred. Robinson's infant son, John, died of gastric fever. In the period that followed, Robinson turned to Mary Ann for support, and their relationship quickly became personal. She became pregnant soon after. Around this time, Mary Ann's attention shifted again. Her mother, who was living in Seaham Harbor, became ill with hepatitis, and Mary Ann went to care for her. At first, her mother appeared to recover, but then began to complain of stomach pains. She died in the spring of 1867, only 9 days after Mary Ann's arrival, at the age of 54. After this, Mary Ann returned to the Robinson household. Her surviving daughter, Isabella, was brought back into the home. Not long after, Isabella developed severe stomach pains and died. The pattern did not stop there. 2 of Robinson's children, Elizabeth and James, also became ill and died within a short period of time. All 3 children were buried within a matter of weeks, between the end of April and the beginning of May 1867. Following Isabella's death, Mary Ann received a life insurance payment of 5 £10 shillings and 6 pence. Despite these events, the relationship between Mary Ann and Robinson continued. They were married on August 11, 1867, at St. Michael's Church in Bishop Wearmouth. Their first child together, Margaret Isabella, was born later that year in November. However, she became ill and died in February 1868. A second child, George, was born on June 18, 1869, and survived. At this point, the situation began to change, not because of another death, but because of a shift in perception. Robinson became increasingly suspicious of Mary Ann's behavior. He noticed that she was persistently encouraging him to insure his life. At the same time, he discovered that she had accumulated debts of around £60 without his knowledge and had taken more than £50 that she had been expected to deposit. He also found that she had been instructing his older children to pawn household valuables. These discoveries altered how the events in the household could be interpreted. The sequence of illness and death no longer stood alone, but now existed alongside financial pressure, missing money, and attempts to secure future payouts. Robinson responded by removing her from the household. He expelled Mary Ann and kept custody of their surviving son, George. After being expelled from the Robinson household, Mary Ann entered a period of instability and was left without a home. During this time, a friend named Margaret Cotton introduced her to her brother, Frederick Cotton, a pitman living in Walbottle, Northumberland. Frederick was a recent widower and had already lost 2 of his 4 children. The remaining children, Frederick Jr. and Charles, were being cared for by Margaret, who had taken on a maternal role in the household. In late March 1870, another death occurred. Margaret Cotton died from an illness described only as a stomach condition, leaving the household without its primary caregiver. In the period that followed, Mary Ann moved into that position, and her relationship with Frederick quickly developed. Soon after, she became pregnant, marking what would be her 12th pregnancy. Later that year, on the 17th of September, 1870, Mary Ann and Frederick were married at St. Andrew's Church in Newcastle upon Tyne. The marriage, however, was not legally valid, as her previous marriage had not been dissolved, making it an act of bigamy. In early 1871, their son Robert was born. Around the same time, Mary Ann learned that her former partner, Joseph Natress, was living in the village of West Auckland in County Durham and was no longer married. She re-established contact with him and persuaded her current household to relocate closer to that area. By the end of that same year, another death took place. Frederick Cotton died in December 1871, with the cause recorded as gastric fever. As in previous cases, insurance had been arranged. Policies had been taken out on Frederick's life and on the lives of his sons. After the death of Frederick Cotton, Joseph Natress moved into Mary Ann's household as a lodger. Their relationship, which had existed in the background before, now became part of her immediate living situation. Around this time, Mary Ann found work again as a nurse, this time caring for an excise officer who was recovering from smallpox. Some later accounts refer to this man as John Quick Manning, but there is no clear record of anyone by that name in official archives. A man named Richard Quick Mann, who worked in customs and excise and had connections to breweries, does appear in historical records, and it is possible that this was the individual involved. During this period, Mary Ann became pregnant once more, carrying what would be her 13th child, likely by Natress. The pattern within the household continued. In March 1872, Frederick Cotton's son, Frederick Jr., died. Shortly afterward, the infant Robert, Mary Ann's child with Frederick, also died. Not long after these deaths, Natress himself became ill. His condition was described in familiar terms as gastric fever. Before his death, he revised his will in a way that benefited Mary Ann, and then he died soon after. At the same time, another financial element remained in place. An insurance policy had already been taken out on Charles, the remaining child from Frederick Cotton's family, and that policy had not yet been collected. By this stage, the sequence of events no longer depended on a single household or a single relationship. It continued across different settings, with the same pattern repeating. Individuals became ill with similar symptoms, deaths followed within a relatively short time, and financial arrangements, whether through insurance or inheritance, remained consistently connected to those outcomes. Mary Ann's situation began to change when an external observer entered the pattern. A parish official named Thomas Riley, who also served as assistant coroner in West Auckland, approached her with a request. He asked if she could help nurse a woman who was ill with smallpox. During this interaction, Mary Ann raised a different concern. She told Riley that the last remaining cotton boy, Charles Edward, was in the way and asked whether he could be sent to the workhouse. Riley responded that she would need to accompany him if that were to happen. At that point, she added something that stood out. She described the boy as sickly and then said, "I won't be troubled long. He'll go like all the rest of the Cottons." 5 days later, Charles Edward was dead. This time, the sequence did not pass unnoticed. Riley took action and went to the local police. He also persuaded the attending doctor to delay issuing a death certificate until the circumstances could be examined more closely. Mary Ann's response followed a familiar direction, but in a context where it became more visible. After the child's death, her first visit was not to a doctor or to any authority connected with the illness, but to the insurance office. There, she was informed that no payment could be made without a death certificate. An inquest was held, and the official conclusion returned by the jury was that the death had occurred from natural causes. Mary Ann stated that she had used arrowroot as a remedy to relieve the child's illness. She also claimed that Riley's accusations were motivated by personal resentment, suggesting that he had made advances toward her that she had rejected. However, the situation did not end with the inquest. Local newspapers began to examine her background, and for the first time, events that had been separated by time and location were brought together into a single view. What emerged was not a single incident, but a sequence. Across different households and over several years, multiple individuals connected to Mary Ann had died. 3 husbands, a lover, a close acquaintance, her mother, and a large number of her children, reported to be 11, had all died, most of them from illnesses described in similar terms, often involving stomach-related conditions. At this point, the pattern was no longer confined to private spaces or individual explanations. It became visible as a continuous sequence, extending across relationships, locations, and time, and for the first time, it was being examined not as separate events, but as a connected structure. Up to this point, suspicion had been built on patterns, repetition, and observation. But the situation began to change when those suspicions moved into a different domain. Rumors surrounding the deaths had grown strong enough to prompt closer examination. Dr. William Byers-Kilburn, who had attended Charles Edward during his final illness, had taken an unusual step. He had preserved samples connected to the case. When those samples were tested, they revealed the presence of arsenic. This result marked a shift. The sequence of events was no longer supported only by timing and repetition, but now by physical evidence that could be measured and verified. Kilburn reported his findings to the police. Following this, Mary Ann was arrested, and Charles Edward's body was exhumed to allow further investigation. She was formally charged with his murder. However, the legal process did not move forward immediately. At the time of her arrest, Mary Ann was pregnant, and the trial was delayed until after the birth of her child. On January 7, 1873, while held in Durham jail, she gave birth to her 13th and final child. The child was named Margaret Edith Quickmanning Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton's trial began on March 5, 1873, at Durham Assizes. Before the trial even started, there was already a complication. The selection of the prosecution counsel caused a delay, as an initial candidate was replaced by Charles Russell, a decision made by the Attorney General, Sir John Duke Coleridge. The choice led to questions being raised in the House of Commons, but it ultimately stood, and Russell proceeded with the case. For Russell, this trial would become the first in a series of high-profile poisoning cases that would define part of his career. The defense was led by Thomas Campbell Foster, who attempted to challenge the central assumption of the prosecution. Rather than denying the presence of arsenic, he focused on its possible origin. He argued that the substance could have come from environmental exposure, specifically from green wallpaper in the Cotton household, which at the time could contain arsenic-based dyes. He also presented an alternative explanation involving a chemist. According to this argument, the chemist might have accidentally provided arsenic powder instead of bismuth powder, a substance commonly used to treat stomach problems, possibly due to distraction while serving multiple customers. This line of defense, however, faced difficulties. Medical testimony indicated that arsenic in the shop was stored in liquid form rather than powder, while the chemist himself claimed that other powders were present, creating a contradiction that weakened the reliability of the explanation. After hearing the arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned after approximately 90 minutes with a verdict of guilty. Following the conviction, reports described a brief display of emotion from Mary Ann, which soon gave way to a more controlled and reserved demeanor. She continued to assert her innocence and appeared to believe that clemency might still be granted. Several petitions were submitted to the Home Secretary, but none were successful. On March 24, 1873, Mary Ann Cotton was executed at Durham County Jail by William Calcraft. The execution did not proceed as intended. Instead of a rapid death caused by a broken neck, the rope was too short, and she died by strangulation, a slower and more prolonged process. At the end of this sequence, the outcome becomes clear not only in legal terms, but also in terms of the pattern that had unfolded over time. Across multiple households, a series of deaths had occurred, often described in similar ways and connected to the same individual. Of the 13 children Mary Ann had borne, only 2 survived her. Margaret Edith, who was born shortly before the trial, and George, her son from her marriage to James Robinson. With the trial and execution, the pattern that had once existed across separate places and events was finally brought into a single framework, examined, and concluded within the legal system. So far, we have followed the life of Mary Ann Cotton, from her early years to the events that eventually led to her trial and execution. Her story comes to an end within the legal system, where everything is brought together and concluded in a single place. But she was not the only woman whose life unfolded in this way. If we move back in time to a different country and a different setting, we find another life that begins very differently. This time the story takes place in Bremen, several decades earlier. And it begins not with suspicion or investigation, but with an ordinary childhood in a modest household. Gesche Tim was born into a modest household as the daughter of a master tailor and a wool seamstress, and she grew up with a twin brother. Her early life followed a relatively stable path. She attended local schools, received Lutheran religious instruction at the cathedral, and was described as orderly, diligent, and somewhat concerned with her appearance. She also took lessons in dancing and French, which suggests a degree of aspiration beyond her family's economic position. In 1806, her situation changed significantly when she married Johann Miltenberg, a wealthy saddler whose wife had recently died. Through this marriage, she entered a more comfortable middle-class environment. Over the next years, she had 5 children, although only 3 survived initially. However, this stability did not last. Miltenberg lived a reckless lifestyle, spending time in taverns and brothels and eventually losing his inherited wealth. When he died in 1813, Gesche was left in a weakened financial position. After his death, her life began to show a different pattern. She maintained a relationship with her longtime lover, the wine merchant Michael Christoph Gottfried, who promised to marry her in 1817 while on his deathbed. Around the same time, she gave birth to a child that did not survive. Although she inherited a small amount of money, it did not resolve her situation. She continued to live beyond her means, and by 1821, she was forced to sell her house on Pelzerstrasse due to ongoing financial pressure. She moved to Obernstrasse and continued to rely on shifting arrangements rather than stable income. In 1822, she traveled to Stade, and after returning to Bremen, she became engaged to a merchant named Paul Thomas Zimmermann. Before the marriage could take place, he died in 1823, but not before including her in his will. The following year, she returned to her former house on Pelzerstrasse, now owned by another couple, and worked there as a housekeeper in exchange for room and board. Shortly after her arrival, the woman of the household died. In 1827, she traveled to Hanover to meet Friedrich Klein, an old acquaintance and one of her creditors, to whom she owed money she could not repay. Soon after this meeting, he also died. At this stage, the sequence of events begins to extend across different situations. Financial instability remains constant, and relationships form around that instability. At the same time, individuals connected to those relationships repeatedly fall ill or die, often shortly after becoming part of her immediate environment. Individually, each event can be explained within the context of the time. But when viewed together, they begin to form a structure that is no longer limited to isolated circumstances. Around 1812, Gesche Gottfried came into possession of arsenic. The substance had originally been given to her by her mother in a paper bag, supposedly to deal with a mouse infestation. What began as a practical household item later became the central element in a repeated pattern. Between 1813 and 1817, she used this arsenic to poison people within her immediate environment. During this period, 8 individuals died. At the same time, she did not always administer lethal doses. In several cases, she gave smaller amounts that caused illness but not death, which suggests that the use of poison was not limited to single decisive acts but extended into repeated exposure. By 1817, the original supply of arsenic had been exhausted. For several years, the pattern stopped, not because the surrounding conditions had changed, but because the means to continue was no longer available. After a gap of 6 years, the sequence resumed. This time, she obtained poison in a different form. Through her maid and friend Beta Schmidt, she acquired a substance known as mouse butter from a pharmacy, a mixture consisting of clarified butter and arsenic. Using this, she continued the same pattern. Between 1823 and 1827, 7 more people died after becoming part of her immediate surroundings. The individuals affected were not random. They were closely connected to her life: family members, partners, friends, neighbors, and creditors. The pattern repeated across these relationships in a similar structure: proximity, illness, decline, and death. At the same time, her outward role created a different impression. Within the community of Bremen, she was not viewed with suspicion. Instead, she was seen as devoted and attentive, someone who cared for the sick with patience and consistency. Because of this, she was given the name Angel of Bremen. This contrast between appearance and outcome allowed the pattern to continue over time. Each individual event could be understood as illness or misfortune, but when viewed across the full sequence, a consistent structure becomes visible, defined by repeated access, similar symptoms, and the same underlying method. Gesche Gottfried's pattern did not end on its own. She continued to administer small, non-lethal doses of poison, which prolonged illness and maintained the appearance of natural decline rather than immediate death. At the same time, the environment around her began to change. Her landlord, Johann Christoph Rumpf, grew increasingly suspicious, and rumors about the number of deaths connected to her began to circulate more widely throughout the city. The turning point came through a simple observation. One day, Rumpf discovered small white granules in a piece of ham. Instead of ignoring it, he chose to have it examined. The substance was analyzed by a physician who had already been involved in examining several of the previous victims, and it was identified as arsenic. With that, the pattern that had remained hidden behind illness and coincidence was exposed through physical evidence. On the evening of March 6, 1828, her birthday, Gesche Gottfried was arrested and taken into custody. She was later transferred to a detention facility at Osterder, where she would remain for nearly 3 years. During this time, she was repeatedly questioned by the examining magistrate, Franz Friedrich Drost, and the interrogations were formally recorded. In these sessions, she spoke not only about her actions, but also about the fear that accompanied them. Authorities and her defense sought to understand not just what had happened, but why it had continued over such a long period. While in prison, she reportedly considered ending her own life using poison she had managed to bring inside. However, she did not follow through with it. The reason was not uncertainty about the act itself, but fear of the physical suffering she had seen in those she had poisoned. Over time, an unusual dynamic developed between her and the magistrate. Their interactions became less strictly formal and took on a more personal tone. On the day before her execution, Drost told her that although he had seen her calm and even smiling during her imprisonment, he would have to appear serious on the scaffold, as required by protocol. He emphasized that this was not directed against her personally, but was simply part of the role he had to fulfill. He asked her to remember him kindly and told her that they would meet again in heaven. At this point, the sequence that had once been spread across different households and explained through individual circumstances had fully collapsed into a single, visible structure. What had once appeared as illness, misfortune, and coincidence had been brought together through evidence, observation, and time, and could no longer be understood as separate events. The question of why Gesche Gottfried committed her crimes was discussed extensively, but it never reached a definitive answer. One of the central difficulties was that she herself could not clearly explain her motives. At the same time, an attempt by her defense to obtain a psychiatric evaluation was rejected, which meant that no formal psychological assessment was ever made. As a result, the interpretation of her actions relies mainly on two sources, both written by her defense lawyer, Friedrich Leopold Vaget. These include his defense statement and a biographical work published a few years later. However, these two accounts do not align, especially when it comes to explaining her motives. In the later biography, her actions are presented as driven by self-interest. According to this version, her first husband stood in the way of a desired relationship and marriage with another man, and her parents were removed because they opposed that relationship. Her children are described as obstacles to that same goal, and their deaths are interpreted within that context. In later cases, the explanation shifts toward financial motives, suggesting that economic gain played a role. Vaget's position during the trial, however, differs from this interpretation. In his role as defense counsel, he rejects the idea that her actions were primarily motivated by relationships or financial benefit. He argues that her first husband did not oppose her relationship, and that her connection with her parents was too close to support the idea that they were obstacles. He also points out that the financial gains from the deaths were often minimal or non-existent. Instead, he introduces a different explanation. He suggests that her actions were driven by an internal compulsion, a kind of urge to poison. This interpretation is based in part on her own statements, in which she described feeling a growing impulse to kill, particularly in the later stages of the sequence. At the time, the prosecution interpreted these statements differently. Rather than viewing them as evidence of compulsion, they saw them as an expression of control, specifically a desire to determine the life and death of others. The biography that Vaget later published adds another layer, but not in the direction of psychological clarity. Despite presenting itself as explanatory, it functions more as a moral text shaped by religious thinking. It emphasizes themes such as selfishness and sin, and reinterprets earlier positive descriptions of her character as signs of hypocrisy. Even relatively minor events are presented as early indications of future crimes. These interpretations also reflect the broader context of the time. In the 18th and 19th centuries, poisoning was often considered a typical crime committed by women, based on the assumption that women lacked the physical strength for other forms of violence. One of the early figures in criminal psychology, Paul Johann Anselm von Feuerbach, proposed a different kind of explanation. In his work on another poisoner, he argued that repeated acts of poisoning could be driven by the experience of hidden power, a sense of control over others that could become reinforcing over time. When these perspectives are placed side by side, they do not resolve the question of motive. Instead, they reveal that the uncertainty itself becomes part of the structure. The actions can be explained in multiple ways, through self-interest, financial pressure, or internal compulsion, but none of these explanations fully accounts for the pattern on its own. The trial of Gesche Gottfried did not take place in a fully modern legal system, but at a point of transition. Older legal traditions, shaped by the Carolina of the 16th century, still influenced how evidence was understood, while newer principles were beginning to emerge. This created a tension within the courtroom. The defense relied on the strict rules of proof associated with the older system, and argued that Gesche Gottfried should not be held fully responsible for her actions, raising one of the earliest recorded claims of mental incapacity in a criminal trial. The prosecution, however, took a different approach. Under Johann Karl Friedrich Gildemeister, it relied on the developing principle of free evaluation of evidence, allowing the court to assess the overall coherence of the case rather than depend only on rigid formal proof. The court ultimately rejected the argument of diminished responsibility. Its reasoning followed a standard that would later become central in other legal systems, that she knew what she was doing and understood that it was wrong. The verdict itself followed what many already expected. She was sentenced to death by the sword, and the decision was later confirmed by the higher court in Lübeck. On April 21, 1831, the sentence was carried out in public. Around 35,000 people gathered at Domschaf in Bremen to witness the execution. She was transported from the prison by carriage and brought onto the scaffold, where the sentence was read to her once more. As part of the formal procedure, Senator Drost broke a wooden staff, symbolizing that the judgment was final. She was offered a glass of red wine, but only took a small sip. After that, she shook hands with each of the judges, an act that stood out in contrast to the setting. She was then secured to a chair and began to pray. An assistant lifted her head by holding her hair, and shortly afterward, the execution was carried out. After her death, the process continued in a different form. Her severed head was displayed once more, and her body was later taken to a pathological institute, where it was reduced to a skeleton and kept for decades as a physical object of study. These remains were eventually destroyed when the institute burned down during the First World War. At this stage, the sequence that had begun with individual illnesses and isolated deaths had fully transitioned into a public and institutional process. What had once been private events had been brought into the legal system, formalized through trial, and concluded through a procedure that combined legal judgment, public spectacle, and scientific handling.